Yeah, for sure. For those of you who don't know, my name's Emma. I'm the music director this year for Kappa Kappa Psi, and we're gonna learn about some marching band music. I'd like to go ahead and start with asking all the sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'd like to go ahead and start with asking our panelists, Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Cannon, and JD Shaw, what like your background is in the marching arts. Just kind of give us a little idea of what, like, how you've been involved in the process and that kind of thing.
Who would like to go first?
I vote for Jay.
You said your name first, Dr. Jacobs.
All right. Oh, my background in the marching arts. So, well, I was born on a spring day. No, it was in the fall. Actually, so yeah, I went through, going way back through large band programs all the way back to middle school and high school. High school band was in the mid 200s with that. So that kind of got me started. And then West Virginia University for my undergraduate degree, where I played trumpet for 3 years and was drum major for 2. While I was there, myself and several other marching band members of WVU, we did our monthly trek up to Canton, Ohio, where I marched with the Bluecoats for a year and got my introduction to drum corps that way. Took a year off after that year and then marched my final year of eligibility in drum corps with the Cavaliers. Following that summer, graduated from WVU, was hired onto the brass staff with the Cavaliers. Gordon Henderson was a marching band director at UCLA that just retired. Hired me to work with Cavaliers on the brass staff as a mellophone tech to start out. And then one of the years I moved to trumpets, but I think I was on brass staff with them for 5 years. And from there, then I guess other marching activity other than teaching high school band in Illinois for a number of years, then picked back up with graduate assistantship at the University of Florida, where I did my graduate degrees, working with the Gator Marching Band there, and then with the Pride of McNeese at McNeese State University in Louisiana, and finishing up currently here at University of South Carolina, the director of the Carolina Band. So there's, I guess, my lineage in the marching band and marching arts area.
All right, Emma, you said my name next, so I'll go next and we can save JD. We'll save the best for last. I went to a big high school where we did Big Ten style marching band, different show every week when I was in high school, which was in the Midwest. So that's why we did that, I guess. I did my undergrad at the University of Iowa. I was in the drum line there and started arranging music when I was an undergrad. And then I taught at a very small high school in Iowa for 4 years and did competitive marching band while I was there, continued writing arrangements and drill for other high school bands. And then I did my master's in Cincinnati, where I didn't do marching band for 2 years of my life, which was weird. And then I did my doctorate in Texas. I was a graduate assistant with the Longhorn Band. And then I was assistant director of the marching band at Michigan State for 6 years before I was the director of the Carolina Band for 4 years. And now I'm back to not doing marching band again, which is weird. JD.
All right. Well, I actually started on violin, and then my parents moved to a town in Kansas that didn't have an orchestra program. So they said, if you want to stay involved with music, you have to play a wind instrument. So I said, great, what do you need? And they said horn. I said, super, what's that? And so my mom played for me a record of Empire Strikes Back and said, hey, you hear those instruments kind of whooping it up? And so those are horns. I'm like, pretty cool. But it was already several years into my music education and everything, and I was really worried about being worse than everybody. And my dad was a physician, and we were at like a new doctor's party, and they said, and so the hospital administrator who had thrown the party came to me and he said, hey, welcome, and you start school in the fall. What are you concerned about? I said, well, I'm concerned about I'm playing this crazy new instrument that I don't play very well, and I'm very concerned about being worse than everybody. And so he brought me down to this field where there was this. It was the beginning of June, and there was this like marching band on steroids, and it was the Skyriders Drum and Bugle Corps. And so he waved the guy that was running the horn line over, and he said, "Hey, this is it's a new doctor's kid in town, and he wants to play his horn better." And so the guy handed me this 2-valve G bugle flugelhorn, put it in my hand. He said, "Here, play a few things." And so I played it, and he goes, "Well, your ear is really good, but your sound is, well, nicely put, terrible." So he said, "Be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." And he turned around and walked off. And so we go back to this party that that was being held for my dad. My dad's like, "Where'd you go?" And I said, "Well, he brought me down, told him the whole story." And I said, "Yeah." And the guy said, "I need to be there at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." And I said, "What do you think I should do?" My dad said, "I think you should be there at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." So I went down there and started my career with the Skyriders Drum and Bugle Corps. I was 15 years old, and I marched 4 years with them. And then they were having some financial problems, so I marched my last 2 years of eligibility with Phantom Regiment out of Rockford, Illinois. And after that, in '93, I started on the brass staff, and I was just a mellophone tech at first, and then the brass caption head moved to the program coordinator. So he says, "Well, you're going to act as brass caption head." And I was like, "I'm 22 years old. Don't do this." He's like, "I'll be around. Don't worry about it." So kind of baptized by fire. So several years throughout the '90s, I worked with the Corps. But in the meantime, I was trying to start my French horn career too. So I taught for some years in the '90s. And then some of the other years I was in Austria and Japan, kind of working on things. I'd done my master's at Eastman School of Music, and then in the late '90s I started writing for Boston Crusaders, and writing charts for Boston Crusaders, and then Phantom came around in 2002 and said, "Hey, would you like to come back and write for us?" And so I did, and I was brass caption head and arranger there for many, many years until about 2011. And then Santa Clara Vanguard called, gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. And so I taught there for a number of years, and that was fun. But my heart was always back in Rockford. So I always liked the Phantom Regiment. So after the 2019 season, I went back to Phantom, and we didn't really have a season this last year, but I'm still with Phantom technically. We'll see if Drum Corps happens again. But along the way, I wrote for many marching bands and other drum corps. I wrote for a couple drum corps in Europe. I currently write for the Vandergrift High School Marching Band out of Texas, which just won the BOA Grand Nationals last year in 2019. And so been always involved, and I kind of love it. I have a lot of my French horn peers that are like, "Why do you stay involved with the marching arts and all that?" And the short answer is I like all music. I like everything, and I have a special affinity for kids in marching band and drum corps just because they are the hardest working kids, and it's one of the most free teaching environments you can ever be around, where I don't have to do great gobs of administrative stuff. I'm just allowed to teach with kids that are single-minded about going for excellence, and so it's really a treat for me to be involved with that.
Excellent. I'm really excited to continue this panel. Before we continue on with the questions, I do want to let everybody else here know that you guys are welcome to ask questions, and Kelly and I will be monitoring the chat. So if you do have those, you're welcome to answer them, or you're welcome to ask them, and we'll go ahead and ask them for you. Yeah. And I'd like to go ahead and thank you guys again for coming and doing this webinar.
Excellent. So a lot of the questions we're asking today, some apply to drill writing, some apply to arranging. You all have different experiences in those fields. So just when we're asking a question about the creative process, just kind of take it and apply it to whatever you have the most experience in. So our first question is, what are some considerations you're taking into mind when you are starting to write a drill show, starting to write drill, or beginning an arrangement for any group? So what are the things you're thinking about as you're starting that process? Can we start with Dr. Cannon for this? Is that okay?
Sure. Most of my experience has been with big college marching bands. I mean, that's kind of where I have lived most of my marching band experience. And so the biggest driver for me is always the audience. So I'm not as well versed in effects that impress judges. That's not my experience. My experience is with football crowds. And so I always would start with concepts, ideas, techniques, effects that would impact a football crowd. That's kind of where I've lived my life. And I enjoy that challenge because it's a diverse crowd, but different from what you would see at a BOA or at a drum corps show or something like that. And so that was always the biggest driver for me, is what would an audience at a football game think was really cool or interesting or different or exciting. That's it. That's pretty simple.
Great. Dr. Jacobs, anything you want to add on to that?
Sure. I'll take it from the drill writing perspective. I mean, comparatively, I haven't written for a ton of different high schools across the country, but I have written for quite a few. And I find that whether I've been writing for a group for a number of years, or if it's the first time that I'm writing some drill for a group, the approach is pretty much the same. I may have some better insight to the groups I've been doing for a while and kind of have a good feel for where their strengths lie. But basically, if you're writing for a band other than your own, of course, there needs to be a significant amount of time and effort devoted to talking to the director about what they want and what they have available to them in terms of, and without going into a super long answer, the size of the group, where their strengths lie. Are some sections, more senior laden, or so I hate to say stronger than others, stronger or weaker, but that's what it comes down to. And what they want from their show and what kind of staff that they have. Some groups that I've written for, it's the director, the assistant director, and maybe probably a guard instructor writing for the guard and instructing the guard, as well as a percussion instructor writing for the percussion section. So some bands, it's a little bit free. They just kind of say, well, we'd like to have this number, around this number of charts. Here's where our strengths and weaknesses are, and here's the arrangements. Go ahead. Some others are may have a program coordinator involved, or one of, if it's not the director, sometimes it's, I've had it from all different sides. Sometimes the director serves as a program coordinator, and that's a good thing. And some bands I've written for have had the guard instructor or writing for the guard be the program coordinator, and that's great because I enjoy working with someone. I'd rather have a team-oriented approach, and when I'm going to write drill, than the director going, here's the arrangements, have at it. Because there's the more brains involved in the creative process, the better. Because I mean, hopefully I have some good ideas, but one of the more successful programs I felt most comfortable with, the guard instructor was a program coordinator and very much understood, I think, every aspect of the creative process for the group. And we got to the point, once we knew each other a little bit better, he was very comfortable throwing tons of ideas at me. And he was comfortable with me coming back and saying, okay, I understand exactly what you want. You do know that I may not be able to make everything work exactly as you envision this. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. I'm like, great, we're in good shape. And a good exchange. And I'm giving them count sheets of what I think the phrase structure should look like and how the show's going to progress. And then they're giving them back their version to me, and we meet somewhere in the middle, and there's a huge Google spreadsheet. And by the end, and it's really, that makes the process so much more fun. I'd rather have that than just saying, okay, here it is, go ahead and do it. And I'm like, okay. It just feels like it comes together and is much more cohesive. So, from the drill writing perspective, it's just really trying to get to know what the director wants and get to know the group, and going at that way. And I've written for some big bands, and I've written for quite a few small groups too. And like I said, the process may be very similar, but when you start putting it together is when it comes to be a little different. It's really interesting to write for the different size groups too. So that's what I have for that.
Can you talk a little bit more about, how drill writing is different for large groups versus small groups? I know the pictures are obviously going to be different, but maybe like, I don't know. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
It took me a really long time to get comfortable writing for small groups, even though I guess when my first band was small, so I was writing for that, and I doesn't mean I was comfortable with it. I think it first, and every time I go to write a show for a small band, and we're talking small, like anywhere from probably 50 members, 40, 50 members up to the 70, 80 member, I guess I would call small. It's always a little bit daunting because I'm like, man, what am I going to do with this number of students on the field, and how can I get effect from this, and that is, for me, that's a lot more challenging for the small groups. It's daunting at first, but then when I get into it, I'm like, oh, okay, I can make this work and do this. Which I think writing for the small groups then makes it easier for me, or maybe I write better drill for the larger groups after doing small groups, because I can just build on that or kind of expand it. So, I mean, obviously with the small groups, with any group, staging is incredibly important. With the small groups, it becomes even more important, and integrating the drumline, the percussion side of it, and the guard side of it becomes really important, because that really is going to make the show. That's where I like the guard person I was talking about was with one of the small bands, and those ideas coming from that person, he was like, I loved his ideas, like, hey, we can do this with the guard and kind of bring across this message of the show and the show theme. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, cool. And it's really, I think, gosh, comparing the two, I think writing for the larger bands, for some reason, even though you're manipulating much larger numbers and dots, many more dots on the field, that is easier for me to do than the small groups. I think it has to take a really concentration and sit down and go, okay, what are we doing? How can we make this work? How can we make this effective? And I think there's some things that, without being too specific, that you can do with smaller groups to make sure. Obviously, you want to shrink the size of the stage on the field, and you're working with a much smaller area of the field. And that's where knowing the group and the abilities of the players really comes into play, especially with the smaller groups. And I always wish that I could go and hear the band play and be around them a little bit if I'm writing drill. Sometimes I'm writing for somebody that's really far away, and I don't get to go visit. But if I can go see them and get a feel for the group, because the smaller groups tend to be a little more attentive players, like they hear themselves so easily that you have to be careful about how you stage them and build their confidence. So keeping them closer together most of the time is really important, and aspects like that can really come up a lot. And sometimes I find myself spreading the field a little too much and going, okay, they're not going to feel good enough to play well and sound good. Let's bring them back and scratch that page, just go back and start over, for this movement. So
awesome. Dr. Cannon, while we're kind of on the subject of drill writing for different size groups, I know you mentioned you worked with some different size groups. You want to add anything to what Dr. Jacobs was saying?
No, I mean, there are, I think there are benefits and drawbacks to every size group. When I started teaching high school, there were 46 kids in my band. And it's easy to teach drill to 46 people. You can just talk to every person. It's like, hey, Jay, move over a little bit. And, Laura, go, you just, and then, but you're obviously limited in the kind of effects you can have. And then there's an advantage to writing drill for 350 people, and that's very exciting. But it also, at a certain point, you start to run out of space, so you have to be creative with how you use that. So it's like, if you've ever seen the Allen High School band from Texas, it's like 525 people or something, and It's like they just go on the field and they take up the whole field. There's different pros and cons to every size. So you just have to kind of approach it for what it is and not try to make it something else.
That's amazing. I think we must have been teaching at sister schools or something. It's about the size of the first band I taught too. So that's amazing.
Excellent. I have a question for JD now. Do you have a general idea for what the timeline for doing arrangements for drum corps is like?
Yeah, and it changes all the time. It's a pretty fluid design process because there's a lot of back and forth. As Jay was talking about, working with the guard person with drum corps, you're working with a visual coordinator, you're working with a color guard person, drum person, electronics person now, maybe even somebody who's dealing with logistics of props. And so it's a pretty involved process in terms of design. And so generally when we come together to start the process, it's basically just a big brainstorm session where there's no bad ideas. We just throw everything out there that we possibly can and start talking about more concepts than specific things. We generally come up with a concept of a show or a particular direction, and then and it's interesting to watch that group watch what will obviously spark the ideas of the color guard guy or spark the ideas of the percussion guy. And very often they're very disparate ideas that will do that. So coming to some sort of compromise on all these ideas takes a lot of discussion. And I know generally that we'll start the process in September, but we won't have any solid details in terms of specific music, specific looks, specific things well into December, sometimes January, because we want to keep the ideas going. And the reason for that is, and it's something that I kind of push a lot, because a lot of times people are like, well, let's dial this down. And I'm not ready to too soon, because I like the organic process of just working through things. And sometimes if you make hard decisions, whether it's a show concept or a design or even a title or specific music selections, you find yourself boxed in to an idea that doesn't have the opportunity to evolve into something that's a little bit more organic. And so then usually about the end of December or January, me and the percussion guy are looking at each other going, okay, we're going to have kids students staring at us here in a couple of weeks. We better have something. So we get to the writing process, and then we'll be writing it for camps, and we'll write something for a camp, and then we'll go to the camp, we'll teach it, we'll record it, we'll go back to the design team, and sometimes it's like, yeah, that works great. Other times it's like, nope, that doesn't work, let's throw it out. And other times it's like, yeah, that'll work great if we change it like this. So I always say that my career hasn't really been an arranger, but a rearranger. And I think that's the important process, is that you just keep rewriting as much as you go. And then you kind of build the show over the summer months until you have a pretty good idea what the show is. Usually March or April, the kids want to know what's the title of the show, what's the general level, what do the uniforms look like, what do the guard uniforms look like, all that kind of stuff. So you have to have a better idea by then. And then when we move in, we have the show, but it is, if you ever watch a video of a drum corps from June to what is on the field in August, it's very different. So the thing, even after you've written it, it keeps just evolving, and that's a fun process to do. And because you have lots of rehearsal time and kids that aren't doing anything else, they are single-minded every day to get that thing right, that you have the ability for them to learn new material often and get it in a clean enough so that they can perform it and be competitive. Something that Cormac was saying, he generally writes for college bands, and he's thinking about the audience. I can say that's no different. for drum corps. And I know there are some drum corps in the past that hasn't been important, but in my life, it's always been the number one thing. And not only just the audience connecting with what we're doing, that the kids who are performing it are connecting with what they're doing. And I think that's a very important thing, whether it's drum corps or college marching band or high school marching band, that you're designing shows that the kids are going to connect with and understand, without, you don't have to dumb it down, certainly, but that they're able to connect with these things, because when the students can connect with it better, they're just naturally going to perform it better.
That was so much. That's awesome. Thank you so much, JD. I wanted to ask a quick follow-up before we get to James's question, which I absolutely love in the chat. You talked about how in late December, January, you're working a lot with the percussion instructor, percussion arranger to start kind of building the more concrete definitions and building blocks of the arrangements. Is that process like you write a little bit and then you send to the percussion person and then they write a little bit and you kind of go back, or how does that back and forth exchange kind of work?
Generally, before I've even started the process, the percussion guy and I, or girl, with some female percussion arrangers as well, they say, we talk through the selection, so we kind of know what we're doing, kind of have an outline of what we're doing. When I worked many years with Paul Rennick, and we kind of developed this way of working together where I would write a lot of percussion cues in what I did. And then he would take a lot of those things and he would orchestrate them. But the percussion thing, based on our conversations, was always, it wasn't I wrote the wind score and then throw the percussion on top. It was really considered, and actually it really started back in 2005 when we were doing a George Gershwin show where we were doing a lot of Rhapsody in Blue, and so you had all the piano parts that were in the front ensemble. So I just ended up writing a lot of those, just so that and the back and forth between the winds and the front ensemble and it just kind of was a thing that made the percussion more integral into the program. And so we continued doing that for the next 15 years.
That's cool. Dr. Cannon, as a percussion person, do you have any other insights into how you kind of work with percussionists, arrangers to make your arrangements?
Well, I don't think I'm as much like a percussionist when I'm a wind arranger as I am when I was a percussion arranger, if that makes sense. I'm not sure I really think about it that much differently from somebody else. I'm always so focused on the wind writing that I think my process is probably very similar, and maybe only informed a little bit by sometimes I kind of have ideas that I might sketch in for some kind of percussion thing. But I know JD kind of does that too. Sometimes he has ideas for percussion things too, because he knows he has a lot of experience there. But I don't think I really think of it all that differently from how somebody else might.
Excellent. So I have a kind of a follow-up question, or not I did, but James put a follow-up question about working with small groups in the chat. Just kind of about arranging for these small groups. How do you arrange so that the stronger players are able to help and they be more confident? Sorry. So just kind of extend on that.
I think that's a great question. And it is just as drill writing is very different between big band, small band, so is writing. As Jay was alluding to, you don't want to pull the kids too far apart in drill, so they don't feel like they're just a soloist the entire show. And that goes for music as well. And it's kind of multi-leveled. First, in how you choose the music that you do. If you say you have 30 wind players and you're going to do pictures and exhibition. No, you're not. So you have to think about that a little bit. A big band can produce the power that something like pictures and exhibition do, but that doesn't mean you can't find some other music that does have more of a that relies less on power and more on texture and more on maybe melodic or contrapuntal interest. You can actually, with small bands, a lot of the small bands that I've written for, they actually don't use a drum line. What they'll do is I call it a front ensemble, but they'll actually take the pit and they'll put it on the field behind it, and it kind of decreases the stage a little bit, but then all of the percussionists are on concert equipment, and then it's usually amplified. And so that the smaller band, the wind players are actually marching in front of that and listening to not just the time of the percussion coming through, which really locks in the ensemble, but they also hear this sound. And so once again, they don't feel so alone with that kind of stuff. Then when you're actually doing the writing, I generally write a lot more doublings, where you're not going to have 3 trumpet parts if you have 5 trumpets out there. Let's have 1 trumpet part. Let's have 1 trombone part, 1 horn part that maybe is doubled with saxophones or something like that. And that's where, when you're talking to the band director about writing for them or something like that, you really have to dial down to what are your strengths. Where are the kids that are maybe a little bit younger? How do you write music where you don't expose the younger players, but at the same time, you're not just giving them whole notes so that they don't develop as a musician? So, because you want those kids that are freshmen, that are new to all this, to develop into your next generation juniors and seniors that are kicking it on the field. So you have to make sure that they're being developed properly. And that doesn't matter whether it's woodwinds or brass or anything like that. So you have to be very careful with that kind of stuff. And so I tend to do a lot of doublings and a lot more horizontal arranging, where harmonies are inferred by the counterpoint rather than kind of a vertical stack of notes throughout the ensemble.
For sure. I've worked with a lot of smaller bands, and all the stuff that you're saying is making a lot of sense. Dr. Cannon, it looks like you wanted to add something.
I was going to say that this question applies to everything you do in teaching, in that you have to teach to the students you have. You have to design for the students you have. And if you have a small band, you have to think about what's going to work for your band. And it's not just a different version of something that works for a bigger band or a different band. You have to find the right thing for your students so that they can be successful and develop, like JD talked about. It's the same thing for concert band. It's the same thing for everything you do. And
you have to be careful too, because it's real easy to kind of say, well, what is this band doing across town? And we need to be doing what they're doing. And there's a lot of areas where the schools get so competitive that you feel like they have to do something because they're doing something. And that's, like Dr. Cannon was saying, you have to really make sure you're doing the right thing by your kids and your kids only.
Yeah, it's very, we all have ideas of things we want to do, and that's great. Shows we want to do, pieces we want to play. But we can't think about the idea we want and apply it to our kids. We have to think about our kids and think about what ideas will work for them. And whether we're arrangers or drill writers or whatever teaching we do, it will be very different from one environment to another. I wrote very differently for the Michigan State Band than I did for this band. That band didn't have piccolos. That band had, they had this tradition of great baritone playing at Michigan State because of the teacher that they had long ago that had continued. And I wrote differently for that band. And then when I got here, I started writing for a different caliber of mellophone player, as an example. We wrote some, because of who the other arranger was for a while, we used to write these crazy mellophone parts. And I think he still does that, which is awesome. And so you have to, no matter the environment, college, drum corps, I'm sure JD wrote differently for one, for Santa Clara than he writes for Phantom. And you have to think about what works in that environment, no matter where it is.
That's awesome. Dr. Jacobs, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I was thinking a little bit, in the small band area we're talking about too. JD sparked some thoughts about arranging that carry over to the drill side too. Some of the most effective moments you can make or over the course of a show with a small band come from how the arrangements sit. And a good example is I think early in my drill writing, I think I had like the whole band was moving all the time. Or they were standing still all the time, and so you're certainly gonna have your big impact moments where the whole band is stationary. But you can do so much with the melodic or more intricate part standing still, and the people that don't have nearly as difficult a part moving, or if they're rests while there's a soloist or two up in front, then you can move everybody a little bit more. Or if it's if it's a small band and they all need to be playing for a lot of the time, the guard moves a lot. So taking segments and moving different parts, that way you always have movement on the field. And I think I learned I marched a drum corps that everybody moved all the time, it felt like, anyway, for a long time, constantly. And then you start noticing that there were some corps maybe doing it like I'm talking about, which is great and actually might be the smarter approach at certain times. So I learned as I watched that evolve, and I think my drill writing evolved with that too, especially with small groups. It's like, hey, not everybody's got to be running all the time. They can park and play, and somebody else can be moving, and that way, you can kind of divide the responsibilities. Not everybody's pedal to the metal all the time, and that's a good thing.
Do you think that same thing kind of applies to arrangements? So you're not having one group playing the whole time, as given that you have an ensemble that's large enough to where you can divide up some of the playing a lot of the times. Can you talk a little bit more about how that also works for arranging?
Yeah, definitely. And I like to give time for people to rest, whether it's a small band or a big band. And I'll say it's a little different when you're writing for a high school band and you're writing for Carolina band. I mean, Carolina band has to fill Williams-Brice, and so it's loud and proud all the time. That's just kind of the reality of a college marching band, that you have to do that kind of stuff. But whenever possible, you try to lay it off their chops for a little bit. It's not always possible. But especially with the younger band, the younger groups, trying to give them some time off is key. It's also key to do that because you open up the possibility for more visual stuff as well. And so if I can have one section playing some crazy lick, and then I don't have to have the accompaniment parts in another wind section, I can throw that into the front ensemble, then I've just opened up the whole field for more visual involvement from the musicians, which certainly can be a lot more interesting if we only allow the visual interest to come from the color guard or the dance team or whatever it is. Then it's sort of like having a dinner with one flavor throughout the entire thing. And if you can just change up the visual contrast as well as the musical contrast, then it becomes something that takes you on a little more a palatable journey, if you will.
Question for everybody. As creators, just for like drill, arranging, and just like general music, we all get creative blocks that happen. Do you guys have any ways that you re-inspire yourself to continue working on a project that you have? Let's go ahead and start with Dr. Jacobs.
Wow. The first thing that comes to mind, I was talking about the first thing that came to mind was I wrote for a long time, actually I still do, for a friend of mine that I met in grad school for his band. And I'm flattered by this, he would like for me to come to band camp and teach and do some visual teaching and work some music with the brass a little bit, but more like the visual side. And he had a small to medium sized group most of the time. And some directors will, especially if the bands are smaller, will want to, and for good reason, want to have every student on the field and written for on the field, and which is great from the band director perspective. But on the drill writer side, he would want me to wait as long as I possibly could until he knew his numbers as close as he could. And so I would end up writing most of his show while I was there for the week of band camp, which equated to me locked in a room for 8 hours a day trying to crank out drill for him. And that was the worst possible situation. And I went along with it for a long time just because we were great friends and I enjoyed being at camp and I understood the situation. But eventually I said, hey, one year I said, I don't know that I've got a lot going on. Can I try writing for you from my house, from home, and not come to your camp to do it? And after a little bit of convincing, he's like, yeah, let's try it. And at the end of that process, the drill writing, and I don't think he equated it, but I certainly did. He goes, this is the best drill you've written for me, maybe ever. And I said, then I point out, I'm like, this could be because I'm not trying to do it all in about 5 days in a room stuck there. Because I would really get stuck with that. The creative process would really just drain from me because I felt I was pressured. I'm like, the best I could do to get away was to get in my car and go to Starbucks and come back and get back on it. But being not being there, but the fact that I could get up and walk away from it in the middle of the creative process if I felt like I was stuck or I just needed to refresh, or I've been staring at a screen forever going, what do I do with this form next? I think being able to step away from it's really important, or at least it is in my process too. So, and I'm careful to make sure that I don't wait too long to write, for Carolina Band for shows too, so I can have that time to decompress mid, drill writing and come back and see something differently. Inevitably, when I'm stuck on a form where I'm just like, I've tried like 3 or 4 different things and nothing's working, and I'm like, just getting away from it and coming back, and all of a sudden I see it differently. And I'm like, oh, well, what was the problem there? So I think we're not always in control of how much time we have to go through the creative process and write, whether it's arranging or drill writing. But if you can manipulate it enough that you do have time to go away and come back and go away and come back, whether it's in the day or over a course of the week, I think is important. I know sometimes I work better under pressure in certain situations with certain things, but that does not apply to my creative process, and certainly not in writing drill. It doesn't fit that. So.
For sure. JB, what do you think? Or what are some of your creative processes that you come up with?
So there's a couple things here. One is I'm lucky in that pretty much everything that I agree to write is something that I want to write. And early in my career, when I was doing things, sometimes I would just have to write something that I knew wasn't going to work or I didn't believe in. And that was kind of hard. That was kind of hard to do, but it's never, what is hard for me is to get it straight in my head, what I want to do. As soon as I'm writing, I'm obsessive and I write till it's done. And that's just kind of the way that I work. But sometimes when I'm coming at an arrangement, it's like, okay, I don't have it clear in my head. And so usually what I have to do is I have to listen to that tune a lot. And one of the things I do is I'll play a tune and I'll just sit there either with piano or sometimes even my horn, and I play along with it and just see if I can like improvise some other things on it that are interesting, or I try to look at different chord progressions that make things interesting. But once I kind of have that clear in my head, then I generally just put my head down and I don't lift it until I'm done with the particular arrangement.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, I mean, there's 2 things. The what JD was talking about not close earlier when he was talking about the drum corps process and sort of not closing the door on anything too soon or kind of waiting as long. The best thing is to be in that place where there are no bad ideas. And that's a really fun place to be, because if you're just willing to throw anything out and willing to say anything, it's a place where you won't get stuck as much, because you can just sort of keep, and especially when you're in a group and you're feeding off each other and saying, oh, what about this? And what about this? And then for me, when I've been at places where I'm writing arrangements, and maybe it was like JD said, something I didn't want to write, or I didn't choose, or I thought was going to be a great thing, and then got into it and realized it wasn't as easy to write as I thought. My process is just to keep writing, and like, I got to write something. So I don't think this is like a great baseline, but I'm going to write something. So at least I'm doing something and kind of moving forward. And I know I'll go back and fix it eventually, but if I don't do anything, I'm not going to stumble across that right thing. So those two things are sort of related, where you're writing and like, this isn't going to be the best thing ever, but I'm just going to write it and put it out there, and I know I can come back and fix it. Nobody's ever going to hear it. I don't have to admit how terrible it was at this point. So for me, it's just to keep going no matter what.
Awesome. Okay.
Oh no, I just forgot to unmute myself. I'm sorry. Yeah, so James asked a question in the chat that said, in marching band, the brass brings like most of the power in just like a marching show. Where would you say that like woodwinds fit into that? I know JD does drum corps, so that doesn't really apply there, but working with high schools and other college programs with those, has it become less of a problem that it used to be, because technology is improving and they're starting to mic other sections of the band? How does that apply?
Well, I think, yeah, and I think it's gotten a lot better. I'll say in my when I first started writing back, or when I was in my 20s, I would write the brass parts, and then I would throw the woodwind parts on top of that, and that never worked out great. And that was something that I got beaten around by the band directors I was writing for very, very early. So yeah, it is nice now that you have miking that you can do with that kind of stuff. The other thing is making sure there are big windows where the brass isn't playing, and most usually not the battery as well, or maybe just a section of the battery that is doing some things. But what you also have to do is you as we were talking about small band, large band, if a large band can bring the power and the small band can bring texture and more line and that kind of thing, this is kind of the same thing with the woodwinds. So when you're choosing music, and this mainly goes for high school bands and that kind of thing. Carolina band's something completely different, just because of the realities of the space that we have to perform in. But you have to find literature that offers the woodwinds a chance to shine. I remember one time, and then also see possibilities when you're arranging within that. Just because something is in one instrument in the original doesn't mean it has to be in that. I remember one time I was writing Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, the finale for high school marching band, and it was a pretty big band, but there's a very famous horn solo in the middle of it. And I put all 40 clarinets on that horn solo in the shallow register playing it, and it turned out to be one of the greatest effects of the show, to hear clarinets actually with that kind of quality. And then so you can find things. I mean, obviously woodwinds can play a whole lot more notes than brass players can, so take advantage of that. Usually woodwind players are just like rabid dogs when they see some 16th notes, and they're just attacking them. And so you give them that opportunity. I know a lot of times I'll write some crazy licks for Carolina band, not that we're necessarily going to hear it in Williams-Brice, but I'm not going to give whole notes to those cats sitting there, and so that they can have something fun to play and feel connected with that kind of thing. And I was watching TV, the football game the other day, and you could hear the woodwinds clearly every time the band played. I was blown away just with how good everything sounded. And so there's a lot of times when we think, well, you can't hear the woodwinds. Yes, you can. They become part of the texture. And if you can make and and you offer them opportunities to do that kind of stuff. What I'm not crazy about, though, is sometimes there's a trend in high school marching band where you have to stop everything, pull the woodwinds up front, and then you play a bunch of 16th notes that have no relation to anything going on in the musical thing, just to kind of check a competitive box. So I think it's important that you find literature that has that kind of naturally in it, or that you can make that you can make a variation on something that you've heard before, so it doesn't just come out of nowhere. And once again, goes back to that organic horizontal motivation of the flow of the show.
Yeah, and I would say for writing, like JD was talking about, for a band like the Carolina Band, and when you're arranging and when you want the woodwinds to be heard, you have to think a lot about the register in which they're playing, and that's why when I would write, you all know this, I only wrote high clarinet parts for the Carolina Band, because you don't hear you don't hear the low clarinets when the whole band is playing, but you hear them when they play high. You hear the piccolos. And you can hear the technical stuff, and you can hear trills. so that's why I would write those kinds of things, because you do hear that. Sometimes the clarinet players would complain about how high the parts were, but I want people to hear it. So that's what
we're trying to help you.
Exactly. It's like, you can complain about not being heard, or you can complain about playing high, but you can't have it both ways.
True. Dr. Jacobs, do you have anything you want to add to that about woodwinds?
Other than I feel guilty writing them in the back too much. And I hear about that all the time. But yeah, no, it's yeah, for college band, it's definitely different. And as a director, you have to look for opportunities also to give them, moments where they're not in the back. And I find for high school bands, that's a lot easier, more easily done, just like JD said, in terms of the venue and where they're going to, and how well they can be heard. And hopefully the arrangements give great opportunities for them, again, that are not just fluff, for the judge to check a box because you featured the woodwinds on a fast 16th note passage in the front of the form. But it's it's a little more, it's not more fun, it's a little bit more engaging to write for the high school bands that are competing drill, and to integrate the woodwinds as much as you look at integrating the guard is important too. So I think if I'm flipping back and forth, or I'm in college band mode, I have to be careful when I'm writing something for the high school groups too. I'm like, don't become too stationary, and because you have the freedom. Band's usually not as big, and you do have the freedom to move them a little bit, and that's more challenging too. I mean, let's face it, if you're trying to move in staging aspects, and you're trying to get the woodwind stage well, it is very much like the guard. You're gonna have sometimes where you're gonna have to work them up to the front and then work them to the back, and it's that's where it becomes fun or frustrating or both. It depends on the day.
Awesome. So we're going to start to wrap up a little bit. Maddie asked a great question in the chat, which is also something on my mind. What advice would you give a first-year teacher who may have to create a marching band show from scratch for the first time? Are there resources that you would recommend to learn more about drill writing and arranging?
Could I get in on this one? So very often I get to talk to the marching band techniques class, and the one thing I say is, your first year teaching, starting a marching band, don't hire somebody like me. I think there is a sense that you have to hire design and all this kind of stuff and spend all this money. I think there's some ways to do this. Number one, if color guard is not your specialty, if you have some money, hire a color guard instructor. If percussion is not your specialty, hire that. At that point, the money that you would have spent paying for a drill designer or a music arranger, what could you have done to actually spend that money on bringing in private teachers or masterclass people so that you can develop your kids better? Because you could have the best design in the world, but if your kids can't play, it makes no difference in the world. So I tell most of my students, go find some, get a concept, but then go to the stock charts that are available on Pepper or Hal Leonard, Sheet Music Plus, whatever. Find some stock charts, put them together, and play the snot out of them, while bringing in teachers or other help to make your students play better. Once you get at a certain level and you have that in place, then you can start maybe thinking about the higher design elements of things. I judged a show up in Western Carolina, and all these bands were going out there, and they had these real high sophisticated things. And this one band came out there, and they had a bunch of Hal Leonard Sound Power Series Blues Brothers charts, and they played the tar out of them. And I had them many points above any of those other groups. And I asked the band director about it later. He goes, I can put a good show together. That's not rocket science. What is hard for me to do is to get my students to play better. And if I can spend my money and time on that. Now, I mentioned that I write for the BOA champion Vandergrift. The reason that band is so good is because every kid is in private lessons in that school. They're bringing clinicians in all the time. Yes, it is a rich school. And they don't have, and there are lots of, and some of you might find yourself in rural South Carolina with, $50. Go, good luck. See you in May. That kind of thing. But you also have developed a network of people that some are on this call right now. So if you want somebody to come in and work with your clarinets, there's somebody on this call right now that could come in and make your clarinets better. And you start helping each other out in that regard, and you can really develop a good program with the contacts that you have through all the networking that you do at University of South Carolina. So I just wanted to kind of get in there when we're talking about the high design thing. You don't need it. You need to be smart about it. Of course, you don't want to have something that's poorly designed, but you can do it without spending thousands and thousands of dollars.
Dr. Jacobs, do you want to go, or why don't you
go ahead if you got something? I can follow up.
I was just the only other thing I would add is before that, before the design, before the music, before the drill, if your first year period or your first year in a new job, you need to research and get to know the community and what their expectations are and what their traditions are and what their history is. Because obviously if they're used to, doing a fun show that they do on Friday nights for their football games and maybe going to a competition or two, and then you design a show that's like the 7 stages of grief or something, that's not going to jive with what they're expecting. And doesn't matter how great it is, it's not going to be the right thing. So and that goes for every aspect of your program, but you want to make sure that not that you have to do what they've always done, but you have to understand the community and the traditions and the expectations. Dr. Jacob?
Yeah, look, y'all are super smart people, and if you're graduating from a school of music somewhere that has prepared you well, which you all will, I think it just goes into what JD and Dr. Cannon were saying. I think evaluating where you are and evaluating the situation is so important in terms of finances, like Dr. Cannon was saying, expectations, history of the program and where they are, and where the funds need to be spent, and then using your networking, JD was saying. So you're going to know people who, and obviously evaluate the position in the school where you are first. I mean, if it's a place that's well funded and competitive, and you need a competitive show, then that might affect who you get to help and write for you. Are you going to do stock charts, and that's going to be great? But I think we're talking about like a situation where you may be the only director, or you're stepping in as the director, and maybe you have an assistant at a school where the resources aren't overflowing. Because let's face it, if they are, great, go hire the best people to come teach your students and to write your show and your drill. Call me, pay me tons of money to write for you. Did I say that out loud? Anyway, but evaluating the situation. So you're going to know people that you graduate with or graduated ahead of you that maybe dabble in drill a little bit. And maybe that you're in a school where the drill doesn't have to be incredibly complicated and you don't need 80 to 100 drill sets. And you can call up somebody and say, hey, if I write the opener, can you write the second and third tune for me? And, you know, I don't have a lot of money to work with, and you're comfortable saying that to that person. They're like, well, sure, I'll write it, you know, just, you know, send me a gift card, you know, to Cheesecake Factory or something, and I'll be happy to write something out for you. And same thing with arrangements. There are great stock charts out there that can sound great as, you know, you put the time in on it. So don't, sometimes where we come from in our history will kind of guide our thought process. Like if we came from a very competitive, well-funded program, then you go out and you get all of a sudden you've got a band of 50 kids and you're like, okay, I got to make it as much like what I had as possible. But the resources aren't there, or the need isn't there to do it the same way. So yeah, just open mind and reaching out to fellow graduates or faculty members who are happy to give you advice at any point is really big.
That's great. Thank you so much to the three of you for spending your Friday night with us talking about work still. I learned a great deal. I think everyone on this call really got a lot out of it. And we know we can look to you if we have any additional questions. So thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. I learned a great deal. So I think that'll do it for us today. Have a great weekend. Go Cox. All the good stuff. And thanks to Emma for helping put this together. This was a dream I had at the beginning of the semester, so I'm really glad to have seen it realized now with her help. So.
Yeah, I'm going to be completely honest. I couldn't have done this without Kelly, and I really appreciate all the help and the support that I got with like good questions that we wanted to talk about, and I really appreciate you guys coming out. This was really helpful and really appreciated.
We are really lucky to have people like you here at the School of Music.
Thank you. It's good to see you all. And this doesn't have to be the end of this conversation. So if you think of other questions, just let us know, because you know where to find us.
Yeah.
Anytime. Thanks, guys.
All right, go Cox.
All right. Have a good weekend.